Welcome to Minutes with Marian. And today we're talking a little bit about your own story. What have you seen working in TA?
Well, hi, Alexis, and thank you for asking that very complicated question. I gave it some thought, and let's start with what I think of as one of the key concepts that we use as transactional analysts, and that is contracts. And why they're important is because the goal is not very broad, therefore. It's very specific, and it's an alliance between the therapist and the patient, which means that, number one, we're both on the same path with the same goal in mind. And secondly, and maybe very importantly, when we are making contracts, which are contracts for change with a patient, sometimes it's not so clear right away what a person wants when they come to a therapy group or to a therapist, because often they come with a symptom like anxiety or depression. But when we make contracts, we want to be very much more specific about that. So we probe quite a bit. So it isn't necessarily that we would find out what a contract would be immediately, but rather that it becomes an exploration into a goal and then a path that we take together as therapist and client.
Mm-hmm. And so what happens when you finish your contract?
Well, first of all, there's usually a peak moment. And then after that, if we've reached the contract, then there's a little bit of a drop in energy because we've already climbed the mountain. We've gotten somewhere already. So there's several options. One is to continue at a deeper level. Another is to discontinue altogether because job done. Or thirdly, renew with another contract. Sometimes when someone comes in therapy, they get really interested in the process. And then they begin to understand that it's like they're kind of unthreading themselves. They're peeling the onion and they want to get down more to the core. So it all depends on the person and their circumstance and what they want.
So that's why you feel TA is so effective? Is it because there's a real clear beginning and an end to it?
Yes, absolutely. I think Eric Berne, who I will quote, the master, I think he once said something like, if you got an airplane and the pilot said, we're going toward New York, you wouldn't want to be on that plane. So contracts are very specific, and sometimes they're specific in not only what someone would want, but also what would be the behavior that would go with it, for example, or the shift in feeling, or the shift in self-concept.
Mm-hmm. So it takes a while to get a contract formed then between the patient and the...
Again, I think it very much depends on the person, on the complexity of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think that therapists who know how to do contracts do it very artfully, that it's actually a kind of a combination of science and art sort of combined together in this kind of practice.
So this really sets TA apart from other modalities?
I think so. As far as I can tell from my interaction with other therapists and how they work. Although, again, there is this caveat. For example, sometimes people group together by their symptom group or their problem, like people who are in a grieving group together, for example, or people who are recently divorced and they're in a group together, or people who've just gotten over a psychotic break. So sometimes when people have this in common, you would look at it more as what is the contract for the group. Mm-hmm. But often people go into a grieving group and after a while they don't know quite what to do with it because they're with other people who are grieving and they can reinforce the grieving. So if each person has a contract within that for something that they want, then you differentiate and everyone has their own path along with sharing some similarity with the other people.
So there is, if you're thinking about a group, then there's a group contract, but there's also individual contracts with the therapist.
Yeah, although often when I first learned group therapy, we were encouraged to mix people completely and totally based on nothing other than they were the next person who walked through the door, providing that they were not psychotic, that they were not actively addicted, or they were not violent. So TA therapists, at least initially in the practice, we don't tend to group people together by a symptom group or a problem that they've experienced in their life.
So do you think contracts are more effective in groups than in individual, or both? Personally, what do you personally think?
Personally, I think it may be more implementable in individual therapy, because I know that myself as the therapist, I'm going to kind of be watching more carefully and more focused. In a group, first of all, as a therapist, there's a lot of different things that are required in a group. If nothing else, you have to really be on the ball and be watching everything's happening at once and be very aware and watch the connections. And so sometimes I know I can lose sight of somebody's contract. So sometimes at the end of the year, I'll try to have a contract renewal moment so we can all get back to where we were.
So it's easier to get off the contract in a group. It's lost. The concept gets a little more lost.
I think that can happen, yes, in groups, and also, in individual therapy. That was one of the issues that I know Eric Berne was so distraught about, was the way in which psychoanalysis could go on indefinitely without some clarity about what was the purpose. Why is that person there? What is the therapist trying to do? So the contract helps the therapist a lot too.
Yes, and so what is, how long does somebody generally stay? I'm sure you get this question a lot with TA. You make a contract. How long can it take to fulfill a contract?
I don't think there's a time limit on it. I could go back over many years and look at so many people that I've seen over the many years that I've been practicing. And sometimes I would review it and I would say, oh, yes, of course, I remember that. They went there and they came here, and that was it. So people pass through, as they do a lot of experiences in life, by going to a therapist for a period of time in their life. And how much they need it, how long they stay, and what they're trying to do is just so variable depending on the person, really.
But in your private practice, you always make a contract with the client.
Yes.
Is that right?
I am thinking about it in my mind at all times, and most often try to spell it out unless I forget or something.
Because I guess you both have to agree to it.
Well, yeah, and because of that, I think it therefore invites someone to be more actively participating in their own therapy, rather than just coming in and saying, do me something, I'm feeling bad. So I think to that extent, we have quite a different approach than a lot of other therapeutic schools.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you for explaining about contracts.
Well, I'm delighted going over this with you. And every time that I do a Minutes with Marian, it gets me thinking about more and more TA. So I really am getting something out of this by renewing and reviewing what I've always known and the way in which I've always practiced. So thank you.
Well, the contracts is really one of the main concepts.
Indeed.
Right? Okay. So the next time we'll talk about, what's the next main concept?
We'll talk about something, oh good heavens, you're asking me to do something.
Games. Games?
I don't think so. I think probably talk about some other interesting exploration in transactional analysis.
Okay.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Bye.
Okay.